Fancred. This is Sports by Brooks. We do this weekdays streaming on your phone, tablet. Great to have you with us. Hope you've been with us on Twitter the last, 18 hours, 12 hours, whatever it is. Time has stood still since LeBron James opened his mouth at Staples Center last night. So obviously I'm going to go through that, break it down. We've got some video. We've got some observations you're not going to get anywhere else that's really going to add to the import of this story. And nothing could be more important than this story right now, globally and domestically. We're going to talk about the situation in the NFL that played out last night that I do think is serious. I got a lot of thoughts on the officiating and possible solutions that I'm not hearing from other people, and the implications of this refereeing situation. The one thing I'll say about what happened with the Lions and the Packers last night, and God knows this has been a recurring complaint, is as long as I've been following football, I have never seen this sort of extended, consistent ineptitude from officials. All right. And of course, the accompanying complaints. It's not that the complaints are out of order or over the top. They're extremely legitimate. And we time with the NFL, right? It's the first time something like this has happened. Now that I brought up the unprecedented nature of the poor officiating on a consistent basis, week after week, and the accompanying unprecedented nature of the complaints, think about the Rams and the Saints and the unprecedented nature of that play and the accompanying complaints, right? That was a play. It was like a JFK moment when JFK was assassinated. Everybody remembered where they were. I'm guessing if you're in the United States, when 9/11 happened, you first saw that horrible image of the towers, you probably remember where you were that day. I think if there's a JFK moment for sports, it might be the Rams and the Saints and what happened, because that was such an extraordinary blown call. It's the worst call probably, if you're within the sound of my voice, have ever seen, right? Experienced. That was unprecedented. And now look at today. What's happening right now is unprecedented. So when you put those two things together, I think it's an indication that there is something indeed permanently broken that the NFL needs to look at. And I don't think that the solution is that difficult, be it full-time, year-round officials, or a judge called a sky judge, I guess you could say. Put him on the field, have a wall of monitors right there. He sees what we all see. That's the big disconnect. I knew I was going to go off. I couldn't help myself, but it just comes down to this. How is it that you and I are watching a game and we can see that they're missing all these calls? How is it that the referee and the officials on the field, to an extent, don't have someone on the couch who can see everything the way we do? I mean, how do we know there's something wrong? Because there's great camera coverage, of course. There's got to be someone in the position. I mean, this sounds ridiculous. In the position you and I are in, to immediately get in touch. Now, I think that happened in the Chiefs game on Sunday when there was a correction of a play call. But I want to get into that in depth tomorrow and address specifically what happened with the Lions and the Packers. But because of this LeBron situation, and of course we own this story on Twitter, we are the definitive place to get all of the video, because it's not just one instance of him calling out Daryl Morey. It's actually three, and that matters. And we'll go through it. We'll provide the necessary context that I think absolutely justifies the attacks on LeBron. But Later, we're going to talk to Tim Brando and talk some college football, because I think there are some interesting storylines that have come out of this weekend. LSU and Oklahoma are my top two teams in the country, as I pointed out yesterday on Twitter, because they're the only two teams that have really had to play a game against real competition, right? And LSU, that was a nice win over Florida, a little bit of a struggle. You would think it was like this epic Titanic battle. Kyle Trask really surprised me with his quarterback play. But let's not get too excited. Let's pump the brakes. That wasn't that great a win. LSU, for my money, is the best team in the country right now, as far as I could tell. But they've beaten Texas, and pardon me, I'm putting something up here. Give me 1 second. They've beaten Texas and now Florida, so they've actually beaten real competition, whereas we haven't seen that from Alabama. We haven't seen that from Clemson. We haven't seen that from Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin. You can go down the list. Nobody's playing anybody. It's like a really long preseason. I don't put Michigan State in there as a elite opponent, even though Ohio State did beat Michigan State a couple of weeks ago. Not excited about it. So we still don't know about most of college football. One of the teams that's in there that's undefeated is Baylor. And Baylor is an interesting case. Undefeated, and they've only got Oklahoma and Texas left at home. And Tim Brando is going to be calling the Baylor-Oklahoma State game coming up. So we're going to talk to him about that. We'll talk about Penn State, Michigan, which is really the only game this weekend coming up. Ohio State's at Northwestern. Really, that's about it. Not much going on in the SEC again. A lot of bad teams this year. So we'll talk some college football. Always excited to talk college football. Pro football, I want to spend a little more time on it, drilling down tomorrow on that situation, because there's more than just the games. But I want to talk now about what everybody's talking about. And to the credit of the media, I went through this morning all of the shows, First Take, Undisputed, all the Embrace Debate crap, and Sports Center and whatnot. And, it was being reported. Of course, it could only be reported so much in those mediums. The irony is, the one place where they could really cover it legitimately in the way that I cover it, and I'm going to lay out to you and have done so on my Twitter, is online. But that's where it's really lacking, is the online coverage is non-existent, except just to give you one little quick snippet that comes after the Subway new barbecue bourbon basket, whatever stack. You got to sit through that commercial. Is what I meant to say. Who wants to do that after it's wrecked your browser, right? You go to ESPN.com or any of these sites. So, but the talk shows did bring it up. And the one weird part of that, in terms of addressing the LeBron Morey situation, it's not a spat. It's LeBron piling on Morey when Morey's not around to defend himself, right? Is Stephen A. Smith, for some reason, siding with LeBron. I know it's all staged and made up, manufactured theater. They're playing a role. They're faking their parts, Max and Stephen A. Smith. And Stephen A. is supposed to be the right-wing guy. And, of course, Max is a left-wing guy, which is fine. But they're both fine. But Stephen A. just doesn't come off as authentic in the way he's presenting this and pretty much everything that he presents on that show, in defending LeBron James. And he actually brought up race today somehow. So no idea. To me, him defending LeBron, bringing up race is pretty much as indefensible as what LeBron said last night. Of course, people are really upset about what LeBron said. Most of them, 99.999% of them, because of LeBron's past engagement on political issues with the media, right? Like Popovich, like Kerr. And so that is what most of this is based on, the hypocrisy, right? Viewing those instances. Trump is a bum is a great example, a tweet that he sent out, but there's many others, right? Domestic issues. But now he has a week. He was right in the middle of all of it, right? He has a week to think about what happened in China. He was there. And he comes back and tells us in a tweet that Daryl Morey was misinformed and not educated on the subject. That's what happened. And my whole point in this situation, and if you look at my Twitter throughout this whole situation, right? For the most part, I think pretty much for the most part, my criticism of, for instance, LeBron James and what he said about Daryl Morey is primarily based on how egregiously wrong LeBron James is in his assessment of Morey's tweet, right? In the context of what's going on in China and how serious that is, right? It's extremely serious what's going over in China right now, in Hong Kong, and in other situations. And for LeBron to sign off, which is what he did, on the Chinese government, which has never been more tyrannical in my lifetime, it hasn't. This is a new development since 2012. I laid it out on the show last week. For him to come out after being over there and being silent, and then come back and have all this time, and then say that Morey's tweet, which was fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong, was based on someone who was misinformed and not educated on the subject. 3 times he said it. And then after the last time, he says, I'm not really sure if he is. That's just what I believe. And that gets left out of all the media reports because it was at the tail end of his media availability last night, right? I mean, yesterday, Xi Jinping, the tyrannical dictator of China, which he is, came out and said yesterday that if people in Hong Kong keep fighting for freedom, their freedoms, their bodies will be destroyed and their bones will be ground into dust. That was a report from the Hong Kong Free Press, mainstream press, Chinese press from the mainland yesterday. That's the level of rhetoric that's going on, the serious nature of it. These are violent protests now. They've turned violent, major conflict going on in Hong Kong. And I might add, it's important to note that while the Chinese government wants you to believe this is about independence and sovereignty and all, it's not. It's about basic freedoms that Hong Kong citizens are losing because of the mainland. They want the mainland to turn Hong Kong into what's going on the mainland. That's what this is all about, right? And that's how serious, and that's what Daryl Morey was referring to. He was not referring to sovereignty, which is the way the Chinese government wants you to believe he was referring to. That's not what he was referring to. You can't walk outside and have a mask on in Hong Kong right now without being arrested. That's what this situation is about. That level of a loss of basic rights in Hong Kong. That's one example of why it's going on. But as far as I want to get specific with you about what took place, because why would you know? You're not like me. You're not sitting around monitoring this thing 24/7. But I want to get specific exactly about what was tweeted out. But the first tweet I want to give you and read to you, the first one, right, came actually last year. And the tweet reads, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." It starts, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." Now, that could very well be Daryl Morey. Maybe he tweeted about Hong Kong in the past or the people of China. Actually, it's not. It's from LeBron James. LeBron James, he tweeted that. "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." January 15th, 2018. That's LeBron James tweeting, right? Now, let me read you a tweet, not his comments that you've seen on video and reported, a tweet that he sent out yesterday in relation to the situation. "My team in this league just went through a difficult week." This is me in a 5-star hotel. Yeah. Not saying anything. Here's LeBron. Here's his tweet. "I think people need to understand what a tweet or a statement can do to others." Right? And I believe nobody stopped nobody. It's one person. And I believe nobody stopped and considered what would happen. Here's the key last line. This is why I'm reading it. "Could have waited a week to send it. Could have waited a week to send it." That's the end of LeBron's tweet yesterday. He's talking about Morey's tweet that inconvenienced him and maybe hurt his business or finances. Well, not anymore. Not after last night. Not after he sided with the Chinese government. Now LeBron's all set. It's all patched up with the tyrannical dictator who's going to grind up the bones of people in Hong Kong to dust. Now, the reason I read those two back to back, his 2018 tweet, remember that tweet says, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Our lives begin to end the day we become silent about things that matter." And of course, the last line of his tweet yesterday, "You could have waited a week to send it." Okay? So that provides you a little bit of context when it comes to the hypocrisy of LeBron James, right? Him speaking out on domestic issues and that hypocrisy is all based on his criticism of the United States, the president, and people inside this country, right? That's not so much what my criticism is based on. My criticism is based on what's actually happening in China and Hong Kong, and I know it involves all of us here in the United States. We're all participants, right? Apple, if you've got an iPhone, you're a participant in what's happening. But in fact, you could argue that, latent guilt in some ways is fueling the criticism of LeBron James. But let's not go too deep with it, because I don't think that's what it is. I think it's just people that were waiting to jump on him. But there is legitimacy in jumping on him. And so do you have some video ready for us? Cam Smith, our producer in Boston. I want to bring up some clips. Now, LeBron spoke for 7.5, 8 minutes last night at Staples. That's where all this came out of. And for the most part, from what I've seen, and we're going to have a reporter who was actually there and recorded one of the videos that's today on Twitter and has like 5 million views right now. Mark Medina of USA Today, I believe. USA Today. He was there. I actually used one of his videos in one of my tweets, interviewing LeBron James with everybody else. So we're going to talk to him in the next hour and get some insight into what was going on. I really want to hear about the aftermath. I want to hear about the conversation because that was before the game. LeBron didn't play in the game. He sat out. So we're going to take you, we're going to bring you to Los Angeles. That's where I am, of course, and talk to Mark Medina about that from USA Today. But I'm going to try to run through these quickly for you, very, very short. But so he actually said that Morey was misinformed and all that 3 different times in about 8 minutes. All right. The first time he said it, quote, when you're misinformed or not educated about something, and I'm talking about the tweet itself, you never know the ramifications that can happen. And so if you've got that first clip, we could play that if you've got it, Cam.
The tweet itself, educated about something, and I'm just talking about, the tweet itself, you never know the ramifications that can happen. We all seen what that did. Not only did for our league, but for all of us in America, for people in China as well. And sometimes you have to think through things that you say that may cause harm, not only for yourself, but for the majority of people. And I think that's just a prime example of that. When you
Can you run that back one more time? Run that back one more time. This is the first instance, so you hear the whole thing.
I'm just misinformed, or you're not educated about something, and I'm just talking about, the tweet itself. You never know the ramifications that can happen, we all seen what that did. Not only did for our league, but for all of us in America, for people in China as well. And sometimes you have to think through things that you say that may cause harm, not only for yourself, but for the majority of people. And I think that's just a prime example of that.
It caused harm. The tweet caused harm for the majority of people. Majority of people. Right there is the best insight into the mind of LeBron James, how he looks at the world. And I think it's a product of someone who has been agreed with since he's 10 years old, right? Since he was a child, he has been catered to, fawned over, and agreed with since his childhood. So, and of course, the media amplifies that exponentially. The response right now is a great example. There's some condemnation of it, but it's pretty much muted, and the situation is treated like any other spat, as if this is a spat. It's not a spat. But there's nobody who's treating this situation as it should be treated besides us, in using it to understand ourselves, along with, of course, what's happening in China, which really is important. If you don't think that we're joined at the hip in China, we absolutely are in ways you cannot imagine. So I'm not going to go down that road, but I think that's the crucial point. And we've got an unprecedented situation in China with an authoritarian regime. And we're absolutely complicit, all of us. Right? So that's the first one. Let's pull up the second video clip before I ruin it and tell you what he said. Do you have the second video clip? So this is the second instance of him saying it. He said it 3 times. The misinformed. Go ahead.
Do you think that Daryl should have been reprimanded?
I think that's another situation that should stay behind closed doors. We are to see what happens with any one of our players, or with an owner, or with a GM at a later date. I think when we all sit back and learn from the situation that happened, understand that what you could tweet or could say, and we all talk about this freedom of speech. Yes, we all do have freedom of speech, but at times there are ramifications for the negative that can happen when you're not thinking about others and you're only thinking about yourself. So I don't believe, I don't want to get into a word or sentence feud with Daryl.
Feud.
Daryl Morey, but I believe he wasn't educated on the situation at hand, and he spoke, and so many people harmed, not only financially but physically, emotionally, spiritually. So just be careful what we tweet and we say and what we do. Even though yes, we do have freedom of speech, but there can be a lot of negative that comes with that too.
Right. Obviously, there's a lot of negative that comes with freedom of speech, right? When you're LeBron James. He's the ultimate example in the last 24 hours. A lot of negatives can come along with freedom of speech. Of course, they don't have that luxury in China, which is obviously law, or Hong Kong for the most part, which is obviously lost on really everybody who's involved in this story. But key part of those comments, I think, involves him saying, so many people could have been harmed, not only financially, but physically, emotionally, spiritually, harmed by Daryl Morey saying on Twitter, fight for freedom, stand with Hong Kong. That's going to harm people physically, emotionally, and spiritually. Right? Okay. First off, physically, let's start with physically. It's going to physically harm somebody, LeBron. What is he saying? Well, in Sham Charania's article in The Athletic, which is an in-depth examination from behind the scenes that includes sources familiar with LeBron's thinking, right? Throughout that article on the Athletic website, right, it drills down on how the players, the Lakers and the Nets, felt that their physical well-being was endangered as this was going on, right? It was endangered. Now, understand that after the first game, the New York Times reported that the Chinese government started to inform all of the media, because it runs the entire media in mainland China and in Hong Kong, to stop piling on the NBA, Lakers and Nets, back off the attacks, back off the editorials and the demands for the apologies and all of that stuff. The Chinese government initiated that after the first game. Why? Because of fears over the possible boycott of the 2022 Beijing Olympics. Okay, so that's after the first game. Obviously, LeBron and company wasn't aware of any of that stuff, and why would they, right? But he obviously didn't have the information, right? Information that he needed to come out and make a statement at the time in China. In that same article, it's pointed out throughout the article by Sham Charania in The Athletic, who, by the way, has the same agent as LeBron James. But LeBron James is the center and focus of this article, right? And it's LeBron James in the article who is the driving force behind the silence of the players in China, because they don't have enough information about what was going on to address it. Unfair. And the league didn't address it because the league had been shut down by the Chinese government and prevented from holding a press conference, right? And so it was LeBron who went to Adam Silver and said, we're not going to say anything. We're not going to say anything. And inquired about possible discipline of Daryl Morey. Discipline, I might add, had it happened, right, would have made the lives of the Lakers and the Nets, including LeBron, much easier, right? That second part where the Lakers and Nets players, some of them inquired about disciplining Morey. Inquired. I didn't say requested, right? That came from Rachel Nichols of ESPN on The Jump yesterday, to her credit. So that's the backdrop of LeBron saying yesterday that they could have been harmed physically, emotionally, and spiritually. If you feel threatened and you're LeBron James, right, in a 5-star hotel, in China, surrounded by millions of adoring fans, which he was, and we saw on the streets, regardless of the propaganda that was put out. Remember, this is a Twitterless country. There's no Twitter. Nobody saw the tweet that Daryl Morey put out in China, unless they worked for the government. It was taken and then disseminated through the Chinese government and interpreted through the Chinese government to the people, right, in the way that the government wanted to. And the government portrayed that tweet as calling for a revolution, a quest for independence and sovereignty of Hong Kong. That's it. Separatists is what they're calling the people in Hong Kong. And the owner of the Brooklyn Nets, Joe Tsai, he comes out. Remember, NBA owner Joe Tsai, who also runs the biggest online retailer in China, Alibaba, same guy, comes out in an editorial and an open letter and says, right, that Daryl Morey was advocating for separatists in Hong Kong, right? The only people calling the freedom fighters in Hong Kong separatists, implying that they want to break away from China and form their own sovereign nation, is the Chinese government, Xi Jinping and Joe Tsai. They're the only ones saying that, right? Joe Tsai is bought and sold, bought and paid for by the Chinese government, clearly. And that was a gesture by him to come out publicly. This is an NBA owner, right, throwing in with the Chinese government. Unfortunately, I have the ability to give you that information, that interpretation, that translation. You're not going to get that anywhere else. But Joe Tsai is their fixer, clearly now in China. Just bought the team, the Nets. So LeBron feels threatened physically. So you're going to do business with somebody like that because somebody tweeted about freedom in Hong Kong? Understand that before 2012, that wouldn't have happened in China. It's happening now because of the current regime. And if you feel like you're physically threatened, which is absolutely hammered home, I might add, in the Shams Charania article, again, that chronicles the behind the scenes of what was happening from LeBron's perspective, the writer who has the same agent as LeBron, Rich Paul, you shouldn't be doing business with the people over there. You shouldn't be over there. In general, the league shouldn't be over there, right? The other part of it is the spiritually, it could have harmed people spiritually. Really? What about, well, there's a group of people we know it didn't harm because you can't harm them any more than they're currently being harmed. And that is the 1 million Muslims in China that the New York Times reported 3 weeks ago are locked down in concentration camps. Okay? That's what the Chinese government is doing. Everybody knows about it around the world. It's common knowledge, right? So I guess we don't have to worry about their spirituality being damaged since they're inside a concentration camp already, thanks to Xi Jinping and the Chinese government. Okay, that's number 2. Now he did it one more time. This is the third clip, and the key is towards the end of the clip. Now understand, 3 times he's calling out Morey. Go ahead and play that clip, Cam, if you could.
Not really educated on the situation. I believe he was either misinformed or not really educated on the situation. And if he was, then so be it. But I have no idea, but that's just my belief. That's all I can say.
So let's run that back one more time and remember that last part of what he said. This is after the third time.
And if he was, I believe he was either misinformed or not really educated on the situation. And if he was, then so be it. But I have no idea, but that's just my belief. That's all I can say.
So we just showed you the 3 times in their entirety that LeBron James, and great job, Cam Smith, our producer here in Boston. And if you're just joining us, we're giving you the definitive breakdown of the biggest story of the day. We're going to be talking college football. Very much looking forward to having Tim Brando on after a big weekend last weekend, and kind of assessing where we are right now. And we're also going to talk to Mark Medina here in Los Angeles. USA Today was there last night at Staples and recorded some of the video that you see on Twitter right now. If you're on Twitter, and you probably have, because you're probably here having been on my Twitter feed perhaps. But so we'll talk to him and find out what was going on with the chatter kind of behind the scenes at Staples Center. But what we've done is we've run through the comments that LeBron James made yesterday that has created this so-called firestorm, not really a firestorm. You know what a firestorm would be, by the way? That would be if anything actually happened to LeBron James that was negative. Now, I asked, as egregious as those comments now are, and if you're following me so far today, I have taken, right, the negativity connected to what he did, LeBron, what he said, and I have added to it exponentially based on what you now know about China and Hong Kong specifically, and just how misinformed LeBron is, and how you could argue both ways with Daryl Morey as to whether or not he should have sent that out, regardless of LeBron. Forget about the context of the NBA, just in general. I think it was an admirable thing that he did. I think it was, I've read reports that it was based on people that he knew in Hong Kong and feared for their safety. I'm not so sure that that's what you want to send out if you're trying to help the situation, but it was an admirable thing to do. But what's interesting is you have it's 99.99% against LeBron in this case, but this really defines our culture. This is a defining moment in our society today, I think, because what's going to actually happen to LeBron? Now, Daryl Morey, very well, and I've talked about why on this show. We may touch upon it briefly today and in the future. Daryl Morey very well may lose his job with the Rockets before it's over. In fact, I believe he will. Not so much lose his job, because there's no way that Tillman Fertitta, the owner of the Rockets, will be able to remove him from the team, which will satisfy China and probably end up rescinding the sanctions that are going to be permanent on the Rockets until Morey departs the Houston franchise. But there's no way that Fertitta will be able to remove Morey from that franchise, right, under the pretense of a firing or being forced in any manner. This would have to involve something that's portrayed as completely voluntary, completely logical. Go to another team, another league, who knows? Around the world, I don't know. I mean, that's a great question that really hasn't been asked. What's going to happen to him? Of course, we don't know, but the fact that, and there's been reports out now, and I cited it on Twitter, I was pretty much the first person, I really was, to start talking about what's going to happen to Daryl, because the Rockets, they're China's team, all right? They're China's team. And it looks like, and it's being reported now, that all of the embargo and the sanctions and the cancellations and all that crap from everything that could cost the NBA billions of dollars, right? All that stuff now is going to be rescinded shortly. Remember what we talked about, the Beijing Olympics? That's a lot of what's behind why we're seeing the surrender of the Chinese government, why this was a temporary thing. Not that they don't use these scare tactics as temporary measures all the time anyway, but that is something to keep in the back of your mind. And a boycott, I think, is something we should actually keep at the front of our mind here in the United States. It's probably the best thing that we could do for the rest of the world and that country. It really is. Boycotting the Beijing Winter Games in 2022. Obviously, the Chinese are worried about it. That's what's fueling them backing off and surrendering. But that's a conditional surrender because the rockets are going to remain under a blockade in China. And that is an enormous financial blow to the owner of the rockets, Tillman Fertitta. He paid $2.2 billion for the rockets on the strength of their international presence in China. Not so much around the world, but in China, because you've got Yao Ming in China, president of the Chinese Basketball Association, legendary Houston Rocket. That's why they're China's team, right? And that is reportedly valuated at $200 million as part of that $2.2 billion purchase price. So just in the valuation alone, the equity of the team, $200 million flushed down the toilet, right? So long as Daryl Morey doesn't apologize, which he shouldn't, and I'm sure he won't, right? So long as he's not going to apologize and he's with the team, that situation is going to remain the same because the Chinese government is going to maintain the blockade on the Rockets. They're going to block the streaming of Rockets games, and Rockets merchandise has been taken off the market in China right now. Most prominently, I might add, on Alibaba.com, the largest online retailer in China, right? They pulled all their Rocket stuff, and that site and company is owned by an NBA owner, Brooklyn Nets owner Joe Tsai, who I mentioned earlier, was nice enough to provide us with some Chinese government propaganda about what's going on in Hong Kong in his rebuke and condemnation of Daryl Morey. There's a point, by the way, to me running down the situation as it pertains to the Rockets and Morey in the context of LeBron. So, absent an apology and with Morey still on the team, right, the Rockets are going to lose a lot of money. A lot. That's probably not the proper way to describe it. It should involve an expletive. Certainly if it's Fertitta describing it, the owner, it would involve multiple expletives, right? Because that embargo exists because of Daryl Morey, because the Chinese government has taken his name and dragged it through the mud to the Chinese people. And remember, there's no Twitter in China. So how is this all happening? Because the Chinese government is communicating everything to the people. 1.4 billion people now hear the name and the word Morey, and that's something bad. And in the Chinese state-run media, all media in China, I want to emphasize that, all private business in China is now run by the government. The government is sticking its nose into the private sector like it never has before in our lifetime since 2012 with this new dictator, right? So in all of state-run media, there have been and continue to be demands for an apology as part of editorials by television pundits in China, right? And in online articles and op-eds, Morey should apologize. That's what's continuing to happen. And it's not going to happen. He's not going to, and he shouldn't apologize. But you get my point now. As long as he's still there, I mean, and of course, with the embargoes continuing, well, those things are connected. They're connected. So there's no chance that Fertitta is going to fire him anytime soon. Now, if they have a horrible year, he would be justified. But I think in the end, at the end of the day, now you think about LeBron James. What's at stake for him as he's making these comments as compared to Daryl Morey? Well, there's nothing at stake for LeBron James. In fact, his situation is going to be enhanced. His financial situation will be enhanced because of these comments specifically. because they're going to consolidate, solidify the financial state of the NBA in China. They're going to go a long way to patch things up with the tyrant, Xi Jinping. And make no mistake, he is a tyrant. He is a throwback right out of World War II, Joseph Stalin, Adolf Hitler. I have no problem saying that. When you've got 1 million people, I don't care what their ethnicity is, their religious affiliation, detained in concentration camps right now, I think it's safe to put them in that category. So we're going to continue to talk about this subject. I've got more to get to on it, but it's almost a relief to talk college football in the context of the discussion. So I want to bring in Tim Brando from Shreveport, Louisiana today, and talk to him about what's going on. They got an interesting game coming up on Fox. He's going to be doing the Baylor Oklahoma State game with Spencer Tillman, of course. And we'll get his breakdown of that and talk about the state of things right now. A guy who is all over Twitter. And so bring up Tim when you get the opportunity, Cam. I appreciate it. And we'll talk to him about what's going on in college football. But if you follow Tim Brando on Twitter, he is someone who is as active. It really is a case study, a textbook example, I think, of a media personality as to how they should handle their Twitter account. Because not only does he present a lot of content, gives you a lot of video content, Tim does himself from inside the press box, all kinds of great stuff behind the scenes. But he also gives you articles and additionally is not shy about giving you his opinion. So he really is a very rare person in the media because he's extremely candid about what he's covering out there. And he also gives you all of this other behind the scenes content, which in the context of the college football media is extraordinary. Probably the best Twitter feed that there is. Tim Brando. Hey, Tim, how you doing?
I'm great, Brooks. How are you?
I am great. And as I said before, it's a relief to talk to you because it's a relief to talk about college football in lieu of what's going on in the NBA right now. So, and I wanted to start off with talking about your Twitter presence. I was just talking about that as we were bringing you up. I mean, what is your thought process on Twitter? Because it's really extraordinary how many things you do on Twitter.
Honestly, Brooks, I've always been sort of an open book. That's been my approach when I run into somebody at the airport or cross paths with anyone on the golf course or even at the grocery store. You know, when I'm at home, I run a lot of errands and pretty much say yes, dear, to whatever my wife says do. And, you know, I'm just an engaging kind of guy. So to me, social networking, social media is just that. We're supposed to be social. So, you know, I do engage up until a point when it becomes clear that the person that's trying to make contact with me really has no engagement in mind. They just want to, you know, spew a little venom and then see how I'll respond. When that happens, I block them. I just get rid of them. I probably would have 500,000 followers if I didn't block so many people. It's become really a cesspool, unfortunately. In the beginning, it's like a lot of good things. You know, in the beginning, it was good. Now, especially in college sports, it's become a lot more like a message board for fans that just want to spew venom about first their coach, second the referees, third the announcers. We're about number 3 or number 4 on the hit list. You know, that's pretty much the way it works. But by and large, there are a lot of good things that can come from it too. And I have found sometimes by simply responding to someone who has a different view and then engaging and having real dialogue. You know, when you have real dialogue, good things can come from it. A little bit like radio and or what you're doing now with streaming. If people just listen to one another or at least read one another, you may have different opinions. It's amazing how we can find some form of détente. You know?
Yeah.
If you don't, if it's just a and listen, it did sort of it started with radio. I hate to say it, but it's true. When conversations with sports talk radio became takes instead of dialogue, okay, that basically emboldened the caller to try to take over your show, as opposed to, hey, let's just have a conversation.
Right.
And I think that's what kind of America has become now. And social media is no different than what you do or what you hear on the radio. I love it when we have back and forth conversations, but I'll also get rid of somebody that's coming after me, both on a professional and a personal side of things, because I just don't have time for those people. If I see someone that wants to talk to me and be hospitable, I'll talk to them for a long time. I will. But if they are coming after me with venom and they want to just charge me with being this or that jerk, or you've seen it, tool, douche, name whatever
Right.
verbiage they want to use, I don't have time for those people. So I just block them and move on.
It is remarkable, I found, that you'll have people attack you, some of the worst attacks you could imagine. And then in the replies, or maybe in DMs, whatever it is, if you just act like a normal person to them, you could say one thing and it completely disarms people, and they apologize. This is after going after you like you wouldn't believe.
Right.
And I think and you just took the word, that was going to be my next question. Everything now is about projection and takes, and so much of it is done, of course, for effect, and it's staged, and it almost gives people an excuse. That's the plausible deniability. Well, it was just, I was giving you my take, but I want to bridge it over to something you've discussed, we've talked about a little bit in the past, is how there's no college football talk that's going on, how everything on, and I understand it's a business and whatnot, but why do you think it is when you turn on, let's say, ESPN? Now, when you think about FS1 and all of their shows every day, now that's an NFL-driven company.
Right.
So it's somewhat understandable that they're going to be focused a lot on the NFL with their daily talk shows.
They talk a lot about the NBA, though.
Well, that's true. Yeah,
They do, Brooks. I mean,
well, and that's a whole nother... And that's another big discussion. Yeah, it's really kind of ironic, isn't it? It's a good. So you really just blew my argument out of the water. But thanks for that. But when you look at ESPN in particular, I mean, no network, no company is driven financially more by college football than Disney and ESPN, and it's all but not on any of those talk shows on a daily basis. Why do you think that is?
To some extent. Brooks, I think it's because of the advent of the collegiate networks that bear the name of the conferences that ESPN owns. And maybe, although it's a 51-49% thing with the Big Ten Network and Fox, it's a little bit of a different vibe because the actual conference itself owns 49% of the Big Ten Network. But ESPN does own, the Longhorn Network. It owns the ACC network, and ESPN owns the SEC network. So I think with the advent of those networks now coming into vogue, from a corporate standpoint, all I can think, and I'm not living there, I don't understand, I don't know the day-to-day working of the place at all, but I have noticed a shift away from what I call mainstream sports media during the day. And to me, that mainstream, of course, is ESPN, Fox Sports 1, and so on and so forth for cable sports. They've gotten away from college sports, with the possible exception of the window dressing programming, that you have on Friday leading up to a Saturday. It's sort of made college football a Friday afternoon, Saturday sport. And by the time Sunday gets here, it's forgotten. We don't look back at all on Monday or Tuesday at what happened on Saturday because the NFL has taken over on Sunday and Monday. And I think their view might be, well, the college fans, they're mostly in flyover states anyway. So let's make sure that we take care of them on these regionally niched networks that bear the name of the conferences. And the sad part of that is we're not getting the kind of objectivity that you'd like to get. I enjoy, and I'm a big fan of Paul Feinbaum's. I'm going to be on his show today. At least he's talking about college football. Now,
Right.
it's SEC centric, but I can wade through that to enjoy just the college football information. And he does have some good guests, and he's an outstanding interviewer. But I mean, if you did the same thing, if you were watching the ACC network in the mornings, I think the world of Mark Packer and Wes Durham, but they are ACC centric. The Big Ten network does something I really love as a guy that's covering college football. They run nonstop live on Mondays and Tuesdays, or quickly live to tape, all of the coaches' press conferences, which from time to time can be a little dicey, you know.
Right.
And I do glean something from that. So I enjoy that. But it is a shame, and I especially now with the fiasco that's occurred in the NBA, I would give a little helpful tip from the tee from Timmy B to my old employer in Bristol. You should talk more college football, because the LeBron thing you want to stay away from. You want to stay away from it as far as you possibly can. It's not a good look. And I had some engagements on media today. One such example of a guy who did say this, well, considering where you work, you probably shouldn't talk about the NBA. And I had to quickly point out that I work for Fox Sports, not Fox News, and that no corporation or no entity is muzzling me from saying what I believe. What you read on my Twitter account is what I believe. It's not a reflection of who I work for. And thankfully, who I work for does not muzzle me from giving an opinion. That is not the case at several other corporations that have media members.
Yeah. And man, I could talk to you for a year about this stuff. There's so many different aspects of this conversation. They're just popping into my head as you go through what you're saying. Visiting, of course, with Tim Brando here on Sports by Brooks on Fancred. But I want to talk some college football now.
Yep.
Because we've got, as you assess what's happening, you've got an interesting game coming up. One of the teams that's kind of under the radar. It's one of those undefeated teams.
Yeah.
That's intriguing because their schedule, while it's not necessarily soft, they still have OU and Texas at home.
Right.
What's your assessment of Baylor? How legitimate is this team?
Well, until they barely got out of there with a victory against Texas Tech last week, they had 3 turnovers, 2 of them inside the 10-yard line, and Charlie Brewer threw 3 interceptions. And they got a little bit of a gift from a poor call on what was called an illegal snap that could have been a fumble in the overtime, which really could have cost them the game, Brooks. But until that game, I thought that they had been playing exceedingly well. They've got good backs. They've got outstanding wide receivers. Probably the 2 teams that are most in the witness protection program among the undefeateds. There are 12 undefeateds. 9 of them are in the autonomous 5. I try to stay away from the Power 5. You know, I just think they're autonomous. And then there are 3 that don't count that are in the group of 5. But Minnesota and Baylor are 2 teams that just get no love whatsoever. I don't think many people, even in the media, could name for you more than 3 players on either squad. They might know who P.J. Fleck and Matt Rule is, but I don't think they would know any of the players on their teams. And they're really good teams and deserve some conversation. They'll get some. We'll be on Big Fox, and it'll be right after the game between West Virginia and Oklahoma on the big noon kickoff. So most of America, I think, will have their first real strong look at them. They've had some games on FS1, but they've been during time periods where there have been monster games on in the afternoons on either CBS or ABC. So, and there'll be a lot of competition for us on Saturday. But I think a lot of people, because we're on the Fox over-the-air network, will be looking at them for the first time. And Oklahoma State's had a week to prepare. They're playing at home. They had an off week. And in Chuba, they've got one of the best running backs in the country. So it'll be a fun matchup physically to see how Baylor holds up. Consider where Baylor was. See, Baylor's in witness protection now, to your point about college football. They are in witness protection as a 6-0 team. Where were they when the Art Briles story hit? They were on the tip of every talking head's tongue. When there is scandal in intercollegiate athletics, the media pounces, absolutely pounces, because they don't have the financial ramifications that come from going after that particular entity. blow up the NCAA, blow up the member institutions. Who's there to protect the school? And oh, by the way, these schools do a lot to attract the negativity. Listen, I'm more critical of college football than any other sport because I'm so close to it and I love it. But think about the lack of balance here with what Matt Rule has accomplished. Okay, when he came over from Temple and took a big deal, he's actually gotten calls from NFL teams in the last year or two and has turned them down. And but you're not hearing much about
and they don't have a network, right? The Big 12 is not necessarily a network.
No, well, the Longhorn Network took that away.
Right. Well, ESPN took that away in enabling and indulging
$300 million mistake that was the Longhorn Network. Yes.
And I think that the bottom line discussion when it comes to some of the big issues that we're always talking about, and I think this is why perhaps it's not talked about in the context of how I brought it up initially is you think about the issue of the college football playoff. Nothing has been talked about more in college football in the history of the sport than the college football playoff. And what it came down to, this is my understanding, is John Skipper woke up one morning and decided to write a check. And so this entire discussion that lasts 140 some odd years comes down to an ESPN president writing a check. And so I think that underlines, what we're talking about with the Longhorn Network and the influence. It's not just ESPN, and I'm not saying they just happen to be in this position right now, but you absolutely can't underestimate, not only can't underestimate the impact of TV on college football, but the fact that it is college football.
It is. Yeah, it is. We would have been looking at the super conference thing immediately. And I remember I was doing my radio show at the time, and I was talking to a lot of my friends in sports business. I'm a little bit of a sports business geek.
Same here.
And the people that were in programming at CBS and at ESPN that I worked with, great names, Mike Oresco, who's now running the American Conference. So many others from my days at ESPN. The programming guys were always guys that I enjoyed learning from. Michael Mulvihill at Fox is that way. The guy is so bright. He's one of the brains that came up with the notion that the big noon thing would be a ratings jump for Fox. And he was right, absolutely right. We've seen our numbers across the board move up because now putting Joel and Gus's game on at noon up against weaker competition has brought more of an audience to our product, and not just to that game, but to other games across the board, because the glut of games were all in that mid-afternoon period dominated by the SEC on CBS and then so on. And then the primetime games that ESPN and ABC have on in combine in primetime. So by moving that game up made a lot of sense. Anyway, during that period, about 10 years ago, when all of this was happening, it appeared that Larry Scott had pulled off this incredible coup to bring Texas and all of these other schools, the power schools, into the Pac-12, turn it into the Pac-16. And I think that once, to ESPN's credit, they found out about this, they were like, "Whoa, wait a minute, let's do this." And DeLoss Dodds, ever the publicist and a really brilliant man, the then athletic director at Texas, was like, "Well, nothing happens without us. Here's what you need to do." Okay. And DeLoss Dodds got that Longhorn Network going, and ESPN did it. And the one thing they didn't get their I's dotted and their T's crossed was getting an okay from everyone within the league for the programming of the they thought they could put all the games that Texas had that weren't on
insanity
television on the Longhorn Network. And of course, the other conference team says, no, you can't do that. Okay, well then we'll do high school games. No, that would be an unfair. You can't do Friday Night Lights on the Longhorn Network. That's an unfair recruiting aspect that you will not be able to pull off. So they were left with very little, if any, programming and no distribution. So I guess to some extent, you could say it was a $300 million mistake, but what it did do was keep the Big 12 intact. And with the Big 12 remaining intact, that meant Kansas State, Iowa State, Kansas were not going to be kicked to the curb, which they would have been. They would have been in a very similar situation to, the Southwest version of Connecticut, just kind of out there wondering where are we going to land at this stage.
Well, when you say it kept the Big 12 intact, though, obviously Nebraska left, Missouri left,
Well, that was
A&M
the
left.
Tom Osborne versus Texas issue,
Okay.
And
Tell us about that.
Osborne was burned up about what was happening from a financial standpoint and how Texas was running the league at that time. I'll say this: the Big 12 has rebounded mightily. A lot of people predicted that it would be the death nail for them when Nebraska left and when the superpower thing didn't happen, and that Texas. What has happened is with the stewardship of Bob Bowlesby, who had some help from Chuck Ninus, who used to run the CFA. And by the way, what a wonderful world it would have been had the College Football Association, the CFA, remained intact.
Yep.
College football would have been and would be in a better place.
Now, quickly, why is that?
Well, because I think the stimulation for teams to play stronger teams, non-conference, have a bigger and better product. Way back when Lee Corso, Bino Cook, and Tim Brando were doing College Game Day, all right, when we had very little budget and we're leading into Ivy League games, Chuck Ninus was putting together a video studio of all of us, with Corso included, talking about having a full-waged college football playoff at the end. He was a visionary. He understood where this thing could go. The problem was Ninus could not get the Big Ten and the Pac-12, at that time Pac-8, to play ball. The mighty Rose Bowl, the granddaddy of them all, was just going to say, no, we have this exclusive time. We're not going to do what we're not going to do. And it took my friend Tony Petitti, who's now working with Rob Manfra and Major League Baseball. He's the second in command with Major League Baseball. Tony is one of the more brilliant people out there that I've ever worked for. It took him to put the BCS concept together. And Tony sold Roy Kramer, the then commissioner, and probably the most powerful man in college football in the early 90s, when he brought South Carolina and Arkansas into the SEC, broke into divisions, and had that first playoff game in 1992. Tony Petitti, who I would later work for at CBS, he was at ABC at the time, a programmer at ABC, came to Kramer and said, how about we do this? And let's form a coalition where we'll
television.
We'll get the Big Ten and the Rose Bowl, and we'll get the Pac-8, the Pac-10 to play ball, and we can have an inclusion so that one can play two. Okay, because for so many years the national championship, it might be 1 versus 4. When in '88 when Notre Dame beat West Virginia, it was 1 versus 3. The idea, the concept of having one finally play two. What I'm saying is, if the CFA had remained intact, we would have had great games, balanced games, that would have been shared by all the networks. See, that's where college football has always missed the boat. If we had a similar situation in college football that we have in the NFL, where multiple entities share the wealth and cross-promote and pollinate the product for the common good of the sport, then college football would grow exponentially. We've never had that. For a very short time, Fox had the BCS, and then during that period, I think ESPN understood, well, we're an all-sports network. We can't afford not to have it. So it was at that point, Skipper, as you said, wrote the check.
Right.
That's why that happened. But if we had more cooperative work being done by all of the minds that are brilliant minds in sports television to help college football, we'd be in much better shape.
I got one last question before we let you go. University of Georgia, Kirby Smart. Let's get down to business here. Can this guy coach? What's going on?
Certain guys have certain strengths and weaknesses. I've always said great recruiting is when you say someone is a great recruiter, but he's not a great coach. Wait a minute. That's really unfair.
Yeah.
That's an inherent.
I say it all the time, by the way.
And that's okay, because in your role, I get that, Brooks.
Right.
But for those of us that are out meeting with these guys and need to have relationships with them, you have to recognize the strengths and the weaknesses of the people that you're covering. I think that Kirby's ability as a recruiter, Kirby's ability to coach defense. Now, remember, his first head coaching job is this job. Okay. I mean, a little bit like Bob Stoops. His first head coaching job when he left Florida as a defensive coordinator was at Oklahoma.
Yep.
He won a national championship, by and large, with talent left over from John Blake. You know, people forget that at Oklahoma.
Yeah.
But I mean, it was John Blake's recruiting that enabled, but Stoops, to his credit, was smart enough to hire this guy named Mike Leach to be his offensive coordinator.
Wow.
And that's brilliant when you think about it.
Josh Heupel was a quarterback.
Absolutely. And then later, Jason White, and we can go on and on about the different guys that were able to win with that offense. And then after Leach left, Mark Mangino came in, and the beat went on. But the bottom line is Kirby Smart in-game scenarios. We saw it with Notre Dame, fourth down situation, could have gone for the jugular, decided not to kick. We saw it in this game. Had a chance to allow his kicker to kick a 55-yarder. There was indecision. They wind up getting penalized. He doesn't kick. Their fans are in an uproar. But there's no denying that in-game decision-making for Kirby Smart is worthy of some criticism. Absolutely no doubt about it. You can make a case. If somebody wants to say Nick Saban would have never lost that game with South Carolina, I'm willing to listen. I am. I'm willing to listen to that. I think that part of the criticism may be justified. But understand this, Brooks, as we move from one week to the next in college football, Ed Orgeron didn't suddenly just become the wisest man on earth. People were mocking him because of his dialect up until about 3 weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
Now all of a sudden he's a brainiac. And what was USC thinking, not hiring him when they had a chance to hire him? The reality of the world we're spending in college football is very simply this. Part of why you're not hearing that much about it is people don't want to cover these 9 teams that are undefeated, that are from the Power 5 and the other 3. They just want to cover 4 or 5 because they're lazy. And they know that we're living in the pure playoff privileged era. 10 years ago, Boise State could be undefeated and had a real shot at the BCS because there were criteria put in place that were not just about human beings saying, you know what, I don't like them in warm-ups.
Right.
They were saying, you know what about strength of schedule? What about this computer poll? What about that computer poll? There were things in place that gave them a chance. Now we got 4 teams, but they got no shot.
Right.
So Georgia could still win out and get in because like Alabama, like Clemson, like Ohio State, these are teams that have brand names. And when you've got a committee of 12 judging this thing like a beauty pageant, and you got old coaches in the room that are swaying all the administrators into thinking the way they think.
And you have the network.
Get in anyway.
And the networks have split. We don't have a CFA. The networks have split up all the teams into these conferences, and they have their agendas, right. Which television has driven. And so it's funny because as I was getting ready to talk to you today, one of the first things, knowing that you were going to do the Baylor-Oklahoma State game was to look at Appy State, look at SMU, look at Boise, and then you have that instant default response. Oh, well, why should we even bring it up? Because how absurd. It is absurd, and there's no reason why it can't be changed. And everything that's laid out in terms of student athletes and all that bull crap about number of games, it's all baloney. Just look at the Big Ten basketball schedule, what they put those athletes through. Yeah. So, but I want to leave on this one. The playoff, then, do you think a playoff could happen that could expand the field in the near future? And for me, in the context of that question, Tim, for me, the dilemma is someone like Barry Alvarez powerful enough to affect an expansion of the playoff without somebody necessarily writing that check?
We don't have, unfortunately, in intercollegiate athletics today, and we've lost Jim Delaney now, too, a real powerful voice in the Big Ten, and not just in the Big Ten, but in college football. Mike Slive was also a guy that was a real leader, would go in and say, this is wrong, we need to get this fixed. I wonder sometimes if our commissioners of the 5 power conferences, who really are in charge of this, Who's
Yep.
going to step forward now? And with Delaney gone and with Slive having passed away, I'm not sure. Now, I do know this, and I think this is the best way of getting it to happen. They are not, my friends over at ESPN are not getting back on their investment. That check that John Skipper wrote was humongous, and they are not getting the return. They were promising and they were believing that they were going to get NFL playoff numbers for the college football playoff, and they haven't. And the reason they haven't is because it's been a Sun Belt invitational. You know, Clemson, Alabama again, Chapter 5 again. If you take out the Big Ten, which has got the most households in America, you take out everything west of the Red River, which has been done for a number of years now, since Oregon played in 2014 against Ohio State. We haven't had a team out west that's been part of this. You are limiting your base. And that's the reason why the numbers aren't where they need to be. The only answer that I can give you is a sports business answer. And that is based on the information we now have, and we've got 6 years left in this deal, and they're going to review it again at the end of this season. Every year in the contract, every third year, and this is now year 6, they'll review it. And they have the right to make recommendations to the committee, they being ESPN. The only way to fix this is to get more inventory, to have greater volume to the process. And an 8-team playoff with opening week games being played at home sites, with the top 4 seeds getting to play on campus, 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3, 6, 4, 5, would be just an enormous boom to the process and would bring everybody in. If somebody says, well, you're making it easier for Alabama, Clemson. No, you're not. You're making them play another game, and you're involving the rest of the country's geography. We need more of the geography of our country to be involved in the college football playoff process.
Man, I wish we had more time, and we're going to bring you back, talk more about these issues. You should write a book, by the way.
I'm working on it. I'm working
right
on
there.
it.
That's outstanding.
And it's a little bit like my thing. Rich Podolsky, what used to write for the NFL Today and was once a media critic. I think he's doing a column again now. Rich has asked me to do one. He's going to help me with it. We got a title, okay? Brando, Always On. You like it?
Yeah. Well, it's true. It's not contrived. It's the real thing.
So,
just look at your Twitter.
And basically, it's not going to be memoirs, Brooks. It's going to be sort of tips from the T from Timmy B on things that you want to do and things that you don't want to do while on the journey. You know, the journey's the best part, but here's some things that I did that I'm really proud of, and here's some things that I did that I wish I hadn't done. That's what it will be.
That sounds awesome. Well, I really appreciate it. Look forward to having you back again soon. All right. Thanks you so much, Tim.
Always a pleasure to be with you.
That's Tim Brando of Fox Sports. And of course, every network you can name needs no introduction. And man, that guy is like a 3-hour podcast waiting to happen. He's a book. He's literally like a walking book. And that conversation really underlines how television is college football. Right? March Madness is college basketball. And that's a function of the NCAA because the NCAA runs college basketball. Television, of course, is what dictates ultimately what goes on in college basketball. But the NCAA, as I've said many times on this show, said on my website, said on Twitter, it's not part of college football except to serve as an empty storefront pretense not to pay athletes with their phony rules. That's it. That's why the NCAA remains in the context of college football. He brought up the CFA. If you don't know what the CFA was, the CFA came out of the mid-1980s, and it stemmed from television. The NCAA used to lord over football the way it did basketball. And the NCAA choked off the number of games back in, the period between 1950 and 1984, let's say, to the point where there was like 1 or 2 games on every Saturday. And if you were an Ohio State fan or a USC fan or a fan of any school, you were lucky to see your team on television more than once or twice a year, and there was nothing local. There was no cable. Can you imagine? Can you imagine an Ohio State football fan or University of Texas only on once a year? You literally, okay? That's what was going on. And so all of the big college football schools got together and sued the NCAA for control of television. And that's what created this College Football Association and really bound together all of the major college football powers and secondary powers for a period of time. That's what Tim was talking about. And so we didn't have this splintered existence now with 5 conferences, 5 agendas, and that's all forged by television. That's accentuated by television. You know, you got the ACC network. Now that's ESPN. Pac-12 network over there, nothing to do with ESPN. Big 12 doesn't have a network. We got the Longhorn network. It's all dictated by television. But the CFA at the time represented more of a united front. That was the moment, though, where the NCAA lost all authority. And of course, it's all based on television and money. That's what college football is. So it's a very different animal than college basketball. And that's one of the reasons why you're seeing what you're seeing in terms of NCAA investigations. I know it's related to the FBI to an extent, but you see the NCAA much more active, you know, as this rules enforcement apparatus in basketball than you do in football. In fact, they're a non-entity in football unless the media gets involved, and that's it. So, but when you're having discussions, I mean, so much of college football it's always been about the playoff. Now it's expanding the playoff, and people think, well, that's inevitable. It absolutely is not inevitable in any way. And it comes down to the whims of the people who are running the television networks at the time that something happens. And that's what happened in the case of today's college football playoff, which, by the way, if you look at the trophy, if you look at the field, if you look at all of the marks, if you will, the logos and whatnot, you don't see an NCAA logo, right? And to me, that's a brazen doubling down, right? An acknowledgement, an open, tacit acknowledgement of the injustice that goes on in the, not paying players, not compensating players, or not providing them healthcare guaranteed in writing. I saw something yesterday on the ESPN website. It was a video feature, actually, that they had tweeted out from the ESPN's main account. And it was a feature on Jalen Hurts. And there he was, a photo of him, and you clicked on it from the ESPN Twitter account. And that took you to this video thing of him, right? It's about Jalen Hurts. As part of the tweet that went out from ESPN, there was a link underneath his photo that read ExxonMobil. ExxonMobil was sponsoring the tweet, sponsoring this production, this video feature of Jalen Hurts, right? So think about that. Everybody's getting paid a lot of money except Jalen Hurts, the guy who's the only reason this thing exists. He's not getting compensated. Now think about that in the context of what we've chronicled here with interviews and what we talked about at length, certainly much more than anybody else. It's not a coincidence. The fact that athletes should be compensated for their name, image, and likeness. That's what the California law is based on, but that's a 2023 proposition. It is a little ridiculous how, it's not going to start for that long, 3-4 years. And I mentioned the Florida bill, the possibility there. We had the guy who wrote that bill, which has now been submitted to the Florida state legislature, a similar law to what California was able to pass unanimously that would allow for an agent and compensation for name, image, likeness. That's now in the Florida legislature. There's actually 2 bills. The other bill is a copy of the California law. The second bill, we talked to Darren Heitner. Chip LaMarca. I'm actually in touch with Chip LaMarca, the representative from Broward County, who is sponsoring that bill, a Republican from Broward County. We're going to have him on the show probably this week. We may have him on Cam tomorrow, actually, to talk about that, because that bill, if it passes into law, could become law as soon as next summer. Now, in Florida, you've got the majority leader in the House saying, "Oh, there's no way it'll pass." Right. So, it's going to be I wouldn't call it a difficult process and prospect for other states to ratify these college athlete compensation bills into law. Everything is dependent on the individual situation. There is one constant: the opportunity for publicity, right? To take advantage of that. And I'm seeing, politicians doing that, right? But this is also swimming upstream, which in a sense explains why it happened in California, right? Because California, especially the state assembly, is an anathema to college football, right? California, very much a blue state. College football, very much a red state sport, if you wanted to put it that way. I mean, Tim mentioned it's got a lot of flyover state in it. Obviously, USC, UCLA in Los Angeles, Washington and Seattle. Austin, Texas is a cosmopolitan city. Columbus, Ohio is a big city now. They've got major league sports, but that explains why California happened in the way that it did, unanimously. So you have Republicans in the state of California voting for it. Then you have Republicans in Florida saying it's not going to pass. Republicans in South Carolina, where there's now a bill saying it's not going to pass. Why is that? It's because there's an agenda for each state. In South Carolina, you've got Clemson, University of South Carolina, but Clemson particularly, well, they like the status quo. And they've got a coach, Dabo Swinney, who wants no part of compensation. He's the most vocal coach in the country in terms of shutting athletes out from compensation. The same guy that Darren Heitner, the author of the Florida law bill that we talked to last week, that same guy, Darren Heitner, posted on his Twitter a document that was, I got a flyer, right? Posted a document that was a trademarking of Dabo Swinney's name, right? Dabo Swinney has trademarked his name. And of course, that's going to financially benefit him. But again, no one could be more outspoken on the subject than the guy who trademarks his own name, likeness, if you will, right? For profit. So that's something I don't necessarily want to go down that road right now, even though I just did, I guess, for 10 minutes. But but great to talk to Tim, and it really, that discussion really underlines the big problem to me, or not so much of a problem, the potential of college football to be so much bigger, even though we have this playoff. In some ways, it's made things much worse, as he stated. Now we're talking about undefeated Boise, SMU, App State, Baylor, Minnesota. Forget about it. They have no chance. Why would we even discuss them? I mean, think about the NFL. I'll have somebody on this week, I'm sure, where we'll talk about everybody pretty much. There really aren't many teams that, I mean, we won't. It's a little bit like, look at it this way. Minnesota, Big Ten team, well-known school, right? Undefeated right now. But I will talk about them if I have somebody on to talk national college football. We actually talk about football, which we didn't do a whole lot of there. But I will talk about Minnesota as much as I talk about the Miami Dolphins. But we're deep into the season, and they're 6-0, and they're going to go 8-0 because they have Maryland and Rutgers coming up. Minnesota is going to be 8-0, and they're probably going to be top 15 team, which they shouldn't be. in my opinion. But right, no discussion. Boise's ranked up there right now, like 14th, nothing, because they literally have no chance. It's ridiculous. And they wonder why nobody watches the college football playoff. I mean, that, to me, Tim brought it up. That should be the incentive to expand it. If you're television, if you're ESPN, they should be lobbying. Well, really, they don't have to lobby, because it's clear that the Pac-12 and the Big Ten is dying to expand, dying right now. Of course, and it does mean money. It means ratings. It means more inventory, right? And all of the excuses, forget about it. Ridiculous. So that's college football. We talked about LeBron James throughout the show before we brought Tim on. And we got into a lot of that. We went through all of his comments and one of his tweets. And hopefully we were able to paint a picture for you that does justice to what is universal criticism. I can't remember someone being criticized in the way that he's being criticized right now. But one of my main points, and I think this is the most important point, and it's ironic because it's the one thing that's not going to be mentioned except by me here on Fancred and on my Twitter account. And I was talking about it leading up to it when Tim joined us, talking about the situation facing Daryl Morey. Daryl Morey very well could lose his job. And I think it's almost a certainty that he will not have a job with the Houston Rockets, in the near future, sooner than later, because China wants an apology from him. And that's hanging there. They're being left hanging. Not saying it's right, not saying he should apologize. That's reality, right? So look at what is on the line for Daryl Morey, the guy who is advocating freedom in Hong Kong. He didn't say independent, sovereign Hong Kong. He said basic human rights that we know don't exist in China to a certain extent. Maybe they do for the wealthy, moneyed elite. Maybe they do for the middle class. Maybe they do for more of what we really even know. But the fact is, they've got people in detention camps, concentration camps. That's a documented fact. It's in the New York Times. And God knows what else is going on. I mean, they don't have Twitter over there. It kind of speaks for itself, right? That's not the barometer for a society necessarily. But the irony of the situation is the guy, Daryl Morey, right, who LeBron James is going after. LeBron James is the guy worth $700 million and only stands to benefit financially from what he said today. And the NBA stands to benefit financially from what he said, right? While the guy who is advocating these basic principles of which our country stands on right now, right? He stands to possibly lose everything, lose his job. I mean, he's not going to be fired, or nothing's going to happen in the context of him being forced out. There's no chance. But there's no chance that he's going to be in Houston, because so long as he's there, the valuation of that team loses about 9 figures. There's going to be about 9 figures taken off $200 million, as I mentioned before. That's the valuation of Houston's relationship in China, because they're China's team. Got it? So that's what's at stake. That's what's going to cost Morey ultimately, right? What LeBron said yesterday is not going to cause the sanctions to be rescinded for the Rockets. But so the big takeaway is, and you really have to sit down and or just remember this. You don't have to sit down and remember it, but just take it in. Universal criticism. He said something that goes against the principles of which this country, our country, is founded, right? And he, LeBron, is ultimately not going to be accountable in any way, shape, or form. I put a poll out on my Twitter account and asked the question, will LeBron James' reputation, I think it's his, I don't remember the exact wording of it, but I put a poll out and asked the question, did LeBron irreparably hurt his brand by throwing Daryl Morey under the bus? 70% of the respondents, about 2,000 respondents, say yes, right? They're wrong. They're 100% wrong. And you know I'm right if you live in the United States. This will all go away like it's anything else. And there'll be no accountability for him. In fact, he'll benefit in the end. Whereas Daryl Morey is going to have this cloud hanging over him. And LeBron just extended that cloud. It's being portrayed today as the opposite, right? Daryl Morey's the hero, but he's not the hero, right? This is, to me, a crystallization of where we are as a society, that we're all screaming at LeBron today about how wrong he is, what a bad guy he is. Yet, we're going to treat him like a god the moment the season starts, right? This all goes away. And the stigma will follow Daryl Morey around, and he's ultimately probably going to be out of a job. That's everything. That's what this story represents. That's what it is, because it represents America. And it's not a pretty picture. It isn't. It also, I think, represents the life of a guy who, since he was 8 years old, I mean, it's really America, since he was 10 years old, was a commodity to people and has been agreed with his whole life and has lived in a bubble. And even when he steps out and makes these absurd, ridiculous, misinformed statements, right? Nothing changes. When he goes to a restaurant or he's going to have his movie come out, Space Jam 2, right? I believe, and this is the last thing I'll leave you with on this subject before we let you go today. All right. There's two things I think in play for him, specifically in his approach to China, LeBron James. Number one, the distribution of Space Jam 2, specifically, China is a critical market for movies, Hollywood. Keep in mind, as far as the NBA is concerned, I'm looking at your comments, by the way. Tony, I'll get to you in a second. And Yayo, I'll get to you in a second, your comments. As far as the NBA is concerned, 640 million people, that's almost double our population. 640 million people watch the NBA every year. So that's how huge it is. So LeBron is being informed by distribution of Space Jam 2 and him trying to acquire an NBA franchise. In fact, I think him going to the Lakers ultimately was designed to try to, affect a coup, if you will, and take over the team in some fashion. That's what I think was behind him, part of it, going to the Lakers. But I do think that as far as any NBA franchise is concerned that he's going to try to acquire, or an expansion team, he may be thinking, look, I need revenue from anywhere I can get it. And China very well could represent that. How much revenue? Well, just think about Klay Thompson's shoe deal. He makes $9 million a year. Klay Thompson, $9 million a year. He's a star, right? From a Chinese shoemaker, a shoe company called Anta. There's three big shoe companies in China: Anta, Li Ning, and Peak. And there's dozens of NBA players getting paid by Chinese companies that are run by the government. Now I want to look at your comments. Tony says in the context of LeBron. But the America First right-wing guys are just seizing on opportunities to pile on LeBron. They don't really care about human rights abuses in China. I mean, I brought that up, Tony, at the outset of the show. Their whole reason for criticizing him, is misguided. China's kind of in the background. It's more about, well, you said this about this person or that person. But in fairness, if you go back to last week with the whole Chinese situation and the way that it came out, it was bipartisan. And I will say, Tony, that hopefully you've heard my approach today, that it's not based on that. Not that I agree with LeBron on everything or disagree on anything, but I'm showing you why it's so horrible, him coming out and doing this. It's bad enough what we're doing over there, right? Bad enough. You could also make the argument that it's a good thing, that it's exposing the United States and our hypocrisy. Think about us criticizing LeBron. We're sitting here criticizing LeBron, as we type in our tweet on our iPhone, which wouldn't exist without China. Think about that. Think about that. And why are we criticizing him? Because LeBron has been outspoken against people inside our own country, right? Not that he's making things worse in China or, collaborating with the enemy, giving aid and comfort to an enemy. To a certain extent, you could look at it that way, right? Yayo asks, what does Rich Paul have to gain by repping Shams Charania? Is that why Woj doesn't get any Laker LeBron related scoops? That's an interesting question. And I'd have to go back and look at Woj and his feed. I'd love to hear some examples. Shoot me some on Yayo. Shoot me some on Twitter or email sportsbybrooks@gmail.com as to what you're talking about. But of course, Rich Paul repping Shams Charania, you saw the story in The Athletic about that situation behind the scenes, what happened between the Lakers and the Nets, what was going on as they were silent, why were they silent? And to me, when I first read those, when I first read the article, this came out yesterday, but way before LeBron's comments came out last night. And when I was reading it, I was knowing all along, well, this has been sourced through Rich Paul and LeBron's people. And LeBron was front and center in the article. And it's not a good look for LeBron. In fact, yesterday morning, I tweeted out some of it specifically, in the context of, wow, LeBron is the reason that they were silent. And he was silent because he was upset that Daryl Morey hadn't been disciplined and that the NBA hadn't addressed it in front of the players addressing it. I mean, it came off as being really self-centered, egocentric, and also the fact that they didn't have enough information. How ironic when he comes out and says a few days later, when he gets back to the States, that it's Daryl Morey who didn't know what was going on. When LeBron James is portrayed by Shams Charania in the Athletic article yesterday morning as someone who didn't have enough information, which is why he didn't speak to it while he was in China. Also in that article, let me reset that. This is important. As part of that Shams Charania article in the Athletic, it was pointed out that LeBron and the players didn't say anything. They were silent. It was the players' decision, not the NBA. Now, the Chinese government had shut down Adam Silver in China, but not the players. Okay? It was the players' decision because they didn't have enough information at the time. And it would be different once they got back to the United States when they had more information. That's what was written. I don't have the text right in front of me, but that's how it was portrayed. And so now that happens, they come back to the United States, and LeBron gives us this ridiculous, ignorant assessment of Morey's outpouring of support. And LeBron calls it selfish. Morey was only thinking of himself. The same LeBron who then tweets to try to damage control it, that Morey could have waited a week. That's what LeBron says in a tweet. In the context of criticizing Morey, in his mind, he writes in a tweet, as damage control, look, he could have waited a week. Really? That's not selfish? That's not thinking of yourself? He's talking about, his physical situation, his well-being. I mean, he brought that up in the, we know that, the Shams Charania thing in The Athletic, there's no doubt that's accurate, because a lot of the things that Shams references were things that came out of LeBron's mouth as he was meeting with the media last night. So I think we've covered this thing as well as you can cover it, at least right now. Next time, though, you hear news about this, or as you continue to consume content and media and ponder it, you've got to remember, right? There's no accountability. Nothing matters here. It's all superficial. It's all topographical, if you will, right? Nothing's going to happen. They're not going to lose. The only time anything has been lost in the whole scenario is when the NBA temporarily lost some sponsors, right? There'll be some lost money, I'm sure. Somebody will lose something in this situation. And of course, the worst of it is attached to the Rockets, because their employee, why? The only people that lose anything in this situation, whether it's the Rockets or it's Daryl Morey personally, is the person in Daryl Morey who tweeted out support for an oppressed people, on the other side of the world. And he's the one, right? But he's the one we're all defending today. No, we're not. No, we're not. We're not defending him at all, because nobody's talking about his future. Nobody's talking about what, except for me and us here. So we'll be here every day. We'll be in your pocket, on your phone, on your tablet, on Fancred, giving you this kind of in-depth analysis, a deep dive. Great interview with Tim Brando today. That was outstanding. And we have a lot of guests already lined up for later in the week. We'll be talking NFL later on in the week as well. And for our producer, Cam Smith in Boston, and from Los Angeles, this is Brooks Melchior saying so long. This has been Sports by Brooks on Fancred.